All right, so we are here today with our first Coffee Connect of the year. And we are going to talk a little bit about health, so high ability learning, and then some of those connections with social emotional behavioral learning. We have lots of great information to share this morning. Just a couple introductions though. So I'm Jill Gunther. I am one of the social emotional behavioral learning specialists with Nebraska MTSS. And then we have a few of our other SEBL specialists on here as well. Chandra is going to be sharing some information with us as well throughout our time together today. Chandra, are you at a good spot to introduce yourself?
I can. I'm Chandra Essex. I'm the SEBL specialist for Region 4. So that covers ESUs 9, 10, 11, and 17.
Perfect. And you probably heard me mention asking Mackenzie or Sarah if they could drop that PDF in the chat. So we have Mackenzie Rydell. She serves our Region 1. And then also Sarah Gentry, who serves Region 5. And then we have a very special guest with us today, Cheyenne Smith. So she is from NDE. She's one of the high ability learning specialists. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Cheyenne.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me this morning. My name is Cheyenne. I am the health specialist at NDE, and so I am the person who you contact if you have any questions, concerns, comments about high ability learning at the State Department. So I am so excited to be here and to share all this information with you today and to be with this lovely MTSS team. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. And again, her contact information is on the slide if you have any questions after our Coffee Connect today. All right, so starting us off with just a quick little welcoming inclusion activity. We've shared before in the past, the first 5. It is just a great resource. If you have not signed up for it, it's a free resource. It brings an email to your inbox each and every day. There's an elementary and then a secondary version with just great ways to connect with kids. There's always like a welcoming at the door, a mindfulness activity, a breathing activity, tons of fun memes and different questions, things like this that are brought to your inbox. I just kind of started a folder and I just drop them in there each day. So when I need a fun activity, then I can just go to that folder and grab something. So our one today, so which classic 80s fashion trend would you get on board with? So what would we maybe bring back? Or, I mean, as looking at some of these pictures, some of them are kind of already coming back, maybe a couple of them, right? So you can go ahead and drop your number in the chat. Which one would you get on board with? Or maybe which one did you love? Chantel, yes, one for sure. Big hair. Absolutely. Some sweaters around the neck. Yes. Fanny packs. Big shoulder jackets. They make me look bigger. I love that. Yeah, see, I'm with you, Sarah. Like I already have the fanny pack, although I don't wear it like that. I just wear it the little like crossbody. And then denim jackets, yes, for sure.
My son actually wears the fanny pack, the traditional fanny pack
Oh,
way.
yes.
Yes, he just feels like he can rock that, so
Love it.
we go with
Love
it.
it. Also love a good denim jacket, Jen. Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for sharing those. Kind of fun to think about some of the things that are still or maybe back on trend right now and some of the things that maybe eventually could come back, right? All right. So as far as resources, we do have a Padlet. So we have the Padlet link there. It will ask for a password, which is all caps MTSS. So a lot of the resources from all of our past Coffee Connects, as well as all of the links that you see throughout our Coffee Connect today, will be all available on our Padlet. So you can go there and access them. Obviously, you can also access them through the PDF of our slides today as well. So just some other additional like general resources around SEBL, and then also our previous recordings for our Coffee Connect if you want to access them there, or the MTSS Media Library. So to get us started, we always like to start off with just a quick little quote. So here we have locally identified high ability learners benefit from targeted services and opportunities to develop their unique talents and demonstrate consistent growth. So just a great way to just kind of really get us thinking about high ability learning. And then, like we mentioned, we're really going to talk about HAL and SEBL throughout our time together today. So what is SEBL? This is our Nebraska NeMTSS definition. So really thinking about that systematic process of really fostering those social, those emotional skills, because ultimately we want those positive behavioral outcomes. We want those positive mental health outcomes for both students as well as adults. We always like to bring in, like, really thinking about if your school has expectations. So we have an example there, really thinking about those positive behavioral outcomes there. But also thinking about like that career readiness piece and how that ties in to SEBL as well. So really thinking about getting all of our students ready for whatever comes after they leave us, right? College, career, community ready. And then if you missed it, last year, we went through each of our SEBL skills. So you see that colorful little star on the screen there. So really thinking about each of those SEBL skills and kind of some of the pieces that fall within each of those. So we did a Coffee Connect on each one of those, shared lots of great resources. So be sure to check out our media library if that's something that you're interested in. Here's just kind of an expanded version of that, really kind of getting an idea of some of those skills that fall within each of those different areas. And then we have an expanded version through those Coffee Connects. So in those recordings, you can check that out. But really thinking about like how we're targeting those self-management skills, how we're targeting those pro-social behavior skills, and some of those pieces that really fall within there. And then we have a little poll for you. So I'm going to let Cheyenne explain the poll everywhere.
Yeah, so we're just going to start this morning by talking a little bit about what we already know about high ability learners. And so, of course, it's early in the morning, but I got to give you a quiz. But the good news is it's true and false. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment, Jill. I already have this pulled up. Okay, can you see the poll? Great. So up here, there's a QR code. There's also a website to join. And we're going to start by asking some questions. So once you get into the poll everywhere, go ahead and answer this first question. So high ability students generally want to be loners. True or false? There we go, a little bit of a split. And some of what we know about high ability learners comes from our own experience with high ability students, right? And so something that we see not only in our own classrooms, but a lot of time portrayed in media and things like that are that the really smart kids prefer to be alone or want to kind of stand out from the rest. And so while it is true that this is kind of a stereotype or that there are a lot of our high ability students that do prefer to be alone, a lot of times they just really struggle making friends. They have a lot of cognitive differences and ways of interacting that they may struggle. And so they may not always want to be a loner, or they may give off that perception of this is their choice, but it's not always true in the fact that they just may not know how to make friends. And so we're going to go with false for this one, but it does sometimes, again, appear in our classrooms. All right, high ability students are more susceptible to social and emotional or mental health issues than their non-high ability peers. Got another similar split, true, false. So this one is actually false. So by research, high ability students are not more susceptible to mental health issues, anxiety, depression, things like that they do have developmental differences, social, emotionally, and with mental health. And so sometimes that presents differently, and sometimes that doesn't always look or is more, sometimes it's more pronounced in our high ability students. But by research, they are not more susceptible to anxiety and depression than a student who is of typical cognitive development. So when I read that several years ago, like I had no idea. I thought for sure that high ability students, because we see them as really high strung or really just intense people, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But it is a myth that they're more susceptible to mental health issues. High ability students are more mature than their peers. True or false? And those of you who have had health students before know that sometimes they're the most immature student in your classroom. And so this is something we're going to talk about later as well, is that cognitive development versus the chronological development and how that presents in the classroom. And so it is a perception that they are more mature because they do think on a higher grade level, but that does not mean that they are not still a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old. And so they may, again, sometimes present more mature because of their cognitive abilities, but they do not necessarily always show more maturity than that of their peers. High ability students always get good grades. That was fast. And these are really common things. The National Association for Gifted Children have identified 10 of their most common myths about high ability students. And this is unfortunately still a really common thing, is that you can't go to the HAL program or you can't be in HAL if you don't have high grades. And so that's something that we always like to stress. Glad everybody answered false, but it's something that unfortunately is still prevalent and still needs to be addressed. How students are aloof and know that their intelligence makes them better than their peers. This is another one that, again, is really common. A lot of advocates against, or a lot of people who argue against high ability learning argue that high ability, if you give a student a gifted label or a high ability label, that they then think that they're better than their peers. But a lot of times it turns out it makes them feel different than their peers, not necessarily better. But again, this is something, it's also something portrayed like Hermione and Sheldon, who have that kind of air of confidence about them that makes this, perpetuates things like this in the real world. And last one, how students should be with students who are their chronological age and are better off with their age mates. So shouldn't grade accelerate, high ability students should stay with their chronological aged peers. This is also actually false, and this is something, again, this is setting up things we're going to talk about later. High ability students don't always need to be with their chronological age peers. There are times, especially in the school setting, that they need to be with cognitive peers versus chronological peers, and so we're going to talk about those differences as well. Okay, thank you for participating. I didn't tell you that it was all the answers were going to be false, but I appreciate it. I didn't want to make you think too hard this morning. So for those of you who have not seen a definition of high ability learner in the state of Nebraska, it has been actually recently changed, really recently, this past legislative session. We took our definition and wanted to align it more closely with the National Association for Gifted Children. And so we define high ability learner in Nebraska as a student who gives evidence of high performance capability or has the capacity to perform at high levels with those compared to their same age, experience, an environment. So thinking about more locally how we're identifying our students versus always comparing them to national or even statewide peers. We want to be sure that we are identifying students in their local contexts, those who are performing well for the environment and the age and the experiences that they've had. Characteristics of high ability students. So these are probably ones that you've seen. If you've ever worked with a high ability student, they're usually what we see is that picture of that student that's verbally proficient, and you can conversate with them well above what their age would suggest. Like maybe you have a kindergartner who's able to sustain a conversation that is a longer period of time or at a higher vocabulary level than what we would expect. Those kids that are learning everything really easily, you seemingly say it once and they've got it. They read, maybe they're voracious readers, maybe they're really creative, have an unusual imagination. And high ability learners are often really sensitive, whether they put that out or not. They have a lot of empathy and a really strong sense of justice, and are really curious. And so we see a lot of that in the classroom, but there are other things that can be indicative of a high ability learner that are often misdiagnosed as behavior issues, or have students screened out of high ability programs, or put on behavior plans and not allowed to go to high ability because of their behaviors, such as refusing to do homework. And now the homework refusal is not a just high ability specific problem, but if the homework refusal is due to they do not feel that they need to do this rote task because they have shown you that they've mastered it, they don't put any worth on that assignment, things like that, that could be not only become a problem grade-wise, but it can really be indicative that that student is ready for something else and ready for something more. They may have difficulty changing topics. And so in the classroom, that kind of self-regulation or emotional regulation may present as meltdowns. Maybe it is just that unwillingness to budge from what they're doing, especially if it's something that they're deeply interested in. They can be pretty impatient with others, not only their peer mates, but with adults as well. They can come off as bossy, especially if you watch in group in peer settings. Their peers may not want to play with them on the playground, or they may not want to work with them because we're going to do it this way. Like, I already know how to do it, so let's just do it this way. Or they've made up this really intense, convoluted game, and nobody wants to play it with them because they're just bossing them around. And so they have this can have this oversensitive overreaction that seems to us like again an emotional regulation issue that may or may not be linked to something deeper. They often that kid that talks to the teacher, they want to follow the teacher around and talk to them because that's who they feel like they can conversate with at a level that they would like, or a level that's comfortable with them, is the teacher. And so that kid that's always coming up to the desk to tell you about what they just read and things like that are also a high ability student. And so sometimes these characteristics on the right, again, can be seen as behavior issues, or I mean, I taught high ability kids. Some days you just want them to sit down and to not talk to you all day, or things like that. And so they can be really difficult in the classroom, and again, cause students to be kicked out of high ability programs or not identified for high ability programs in the first place because they're a behavior issue. And then we talked a little bit earlier about how high ability students are really intense. By kind of brain chemistry and brain research, they have what are called overexcitabilities. And that means that they take in stimuli around them and process it more intensely than that of their peers. And so they can get really overwhelmed and really excited really fast. And not all of them have an overexcitability. Some of them have multiple overexcitabilities. And so and like especially an intellectual overexcitability. And so that's that they always have to be intellectually stimulated, or they will be really upset. Or I know that during the summer, parents like, what can we do with these kids this summer, because like they're driving me crazy around the house because they have to be intellectually stimulated and we can't do that. And so things like that. Imaginational, they're those kids that can tell you this story that they believe, and you might even believe is real, about their dragon in the front yard this morning because they have such a vivid imagination and they see it so vividly. And we have our kids who have emotional overexcitabilities or intensities that cry because a spider was killed on the playground and they just can't fathom how somebody else could like take the life of a spider and at like a 6-year-old age. And so they have those emotional dysregulation pieces sometimes. And then psychomotor and sensual are taking in, again, that stimuli really intensely, like the lights being too bright and the talking being too loud. And psychomotor is usually tapping, jiggling, leg bouncing, things like that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, if you see down here, I have what's called the Misdiagnosis Initiative, which is a resource for parents and doctors, because a lot of times high ability students are misdiagnosed with things like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. Because they have these intensities, it doesn't necessarily mean that their brain chemistry is such that it will be fixed by an ADHD medication or will be fixed by, if basically what they're trying to prevent with this misdiagnosis initiative is giving children medication and it not working. And that's the only way we find out that they don't have ADHD, that they're just an intense kid that's really smart. And so, because a lot of these sound like other disabilities, and students do have disabilities, especially high ability students, but not all of them do. And so we try to avoid, well, clinicians, I don't envy clinicians because it's their job to decide, do we give this child medication or do we try other school-based interventions first? And that brings it up twice exceptional. Our twice exceptional students are students who have a disability and are also high ability. That can look like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, but it can also look like dyslexia, dysgraphia, any speech language disability, any other health impairments, anything like that. If a student has an IEP and qualifies for an IEP and is high ability, they're classified as twice exceptional students. And emotionally, again, we mentioned that high ability students are really intense. And so we know that we can't treat emotions separately from intellectual and physical development. And so just this reminder that their thoughts and emotions and reactions to the world are different, and therefore our actions and our preventative strategies also have to be different. And we know that a lot of times we don't have targeted supports for our high ability students, not only academically, but social emotionally as well. And so we're going to talk about some of those different pieces today. So our high ability students, we mentioned, are intense and overexcitable and have a strong sense of justice. They can also have an advanced sense of humor, which can get them in trouble. Especially at those younger ages when they understand sarcasm and understand jokes that maybe we think they shouldn't. So they're usually pretty perceptive. They can feel your emotions. They can feel others' emotions around them. And so that perceptiveness also, that heightened awareness of others' emotions. And then perfectionism. We've all met our high ability student that is so upset because they got a 99 and they cannot let it go, or they will never turn in the assignment because it's never done well enough. So that perfectionistic characteristic is part of high ability as well. They can also, again, contrary to what we see, can have self-esteem and identity issues. A lot of times they can have trouble kind of making out like, who am I versus like, if I'm the smart kid and I get a C, then who am I? Kind of things, especially as they move into high school and through into college. They can be nonconformist. They've got a lot of ideas and a lot of opinions, and so they can be really independent, and that can cause them to struggle with peer relationships. Also because they're critical. They're critical of themselves and they expect everybody else to live up to their almost unrealistic expectations of themselves. So they can become critical. And again, all of these can cause problems with peer relationships. And a lot of times they question and challenge authority. Sometimes it is in an operative way, and sometimes it really is just they ask questions because they want to place value on what they're doing, to decide whether they're going to do it or not. Sometimes, and so they ask a lot of questions, and it sounds like questioning authority, but it is just trying to get their own bearings of what they're doing. They're whole to part learners, and in school we teach part to whole. And so they really struggle because they want to see the whole, they want to know where they're going and then put the parts together. And so if they don't see a purpose to the stepping blocks, then they may be resistant to doing them. And we're going to talk about what's called asynchronous development. And we talked a little bit earlier about chronological age and cognitive age. So high ability students develop very differently than their non-high ability peers. So as you can see here, a typical child develops their physical, social, emotional, all kind of together around the same time. Like they're physically a 7-year-old and they can write like a 7-year-old and they're think like a 7-year-old. But our high ability students can vary so wildly. Like maybe they read at a 10th grade level, but they're in 6th grade. So they have the social skills of a 6th grader. They could even have the emotional regulation of a 4th grader. And physically, they can write like an 8th grader. And so they've got these skills that are all over the place. And it's so frustrating, especially if you're a kindergartner and you cognitively can write a story that a 5th grader could write, but you've got the fine motor of a kindergartner. They get really frustrated because they can't get their ideas out on the page, or they're not emotionally ready for the themes in a story that an 8th grader can read when they're in 4th grade. And physically as well, they just, especially if we think about when we're sending them to higher classes, if we go several grades above, that becomes a problem. So I have to kind of go through this quickly because I can't believe it's already 8:30, but their regulation can be really difficult. And I hear like, you know, how can you possibly be gifted? You can't write a sentence correctly, or like, look at that sign. And sometimes it's just like they seem really dense and you're like, how are you so smart, but also so unaware? And so it's just that that developmental process is taking a lot of their bandwidth and causing some frustration. And so a lot of those characteristics, again, display as social and emotional behavioral problems. If they have this really strong sense of empathy and justice, they may want to challenge authority for others, take up battles that are not their own. That's something that's really common. Or if they're quick-witted and humorous, they may not be able to make those jokes with their peers, and so they feel different and they feel like they don't belong and things like that. And if we're not meeting their affective needs, we can run into things like underachievement, where they just don't turn in things. So they click through the ends gas and they don't get renewed for HAL because they don't care. Negative attitude towards school because maybe they're always in trouble for being disruptive. They don't feel like they fit in. Their grades are bad. Maybe their grades are good, but they're just bored out of their mind. And so they develop a negative attitude towards school. And we can see chronic absenteeism from high ability students. I don't know if any of you have a HAL kid yourself, but some parents already have been fighting at the beginning of the school year. Like, you have to go to school. And like, I can't go to school. Like, my stomach's upset because they're so anxious to go to school because they don't like it. They can develop, again, that unhealthy perfectionism, that unclear sense of identity. Like, if I'm not the smart kid, who am I? Or I have to be the smartest all the time, or else I as a person am a bad person. A lot of that identity formation. And then they can also become isolated from their peers pretty easily. Again, we can match academic curriculum and fix a lot of problems with high ability students. A lot of the SEBL issues that we discussed can come from the mismatch between the supports that they're receiving and the supports that they need.
And then really just kind of bringing it all together. So HAL, SEBL, and NeMTSS, oh my. So probably most of you with us this morning are familiar with our Nebraska NeMTSS essential elements, but we're really going to kind of hone in on that layered continuum of support piece here. So really thinking about some of those supports at each of the different tiers. So some of those tier 1 core, tier 2 targeted, and then tier 3 intensified supports as we're thinking about high ability learners.
And for high ability, again, a lot of times when we're identifying high ability learners, if you're familiar with what your district does or what region, what goes on in your region, a lot of times data used to identify high ability students or to make decisions for high ability students are test score based, and usually a pretty high test score at that, and usually it's only 1, unfortunately. But and similar for progress monitoring, we make sure that they're staying at that high percentile. But there's a lot of useful social emotional behavioral data that we can get to not only look at a kid for high ability, but to progress monitor as well. We can look at the negative manifestations, as well as if we think about the behavioral manifestations, if we have a high ability student with an undiagnosed learning disability, that is a huge, huge root of some of those social and emotional behavioral issues for our twice exceptional students, is that they've been labeled high ability. Maybe they have dyslexia and they can't read, or they can't read fast, and so they try to hide it by avoiding reading time, or they feel like they don't want to be found out because they think, man, I'm just dumb, or things like that. They develop this really negative sense of self, and so that undiagnosed learning disability, if we have that in some of our high ability students, can be really detrimental. But we already have attendance data, office referrals, detention, suspensions. A lot of schools give SEBL screeners, teacher data. A lot of those different things we can use and say, hey, we have a high ability student who has really high rate of office referrals, or they've been absent a lot this semester. How can we take that data? We can take that data and we can look at their academic program and see if there are academic supports that we need to provide. If we feel their academic program is all right and they're matched up all right, then we need to take a look at that SEB data and see how we can put in an SEBL support to help with those students. And so looking at more than just their academic and test data to help us get a better picture of the high ability student is really useful.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm apologize in advance because I'm kind of an oral processor, so it's not a very articulate question, but
That's okay.
Our districts are really wrestling with this chronic absenteeism and that being an issue. And I think the idea of chronic absenteeism has really been pushed to this. It's either a behavior, mental health issue, and true behavior. I don't like school. You can't make me come to school. Kind of that notion, right? Where I think we probably on this call would all be in alignment with, it's a far more complex issue than that. And I'm connecting with this. Gosh, I never really thought of it being even an issue that our high ability students would even be lumped into, right? So how might you begin to tease that out? Does that even begin to make sense? I'm just thinking of chronic absenteeism is something that's on everybody's mind. And I know that we've got data that our students are chronically absent, and we have that data, I think, more readily available than identifying that it's, HAL students versus non-HAL students versus this type, bucket of students versus that bucket of students. How do you really begin to tease that out, and how are interventions different? I think is my question.
No, it's a good question. So from a data perspective, you should be able to disaggregate your absenteeism data and compare it to your high ability data. If you use PowerSchool or EduClimber, your high ability students should be flagged. And so you can then track their absenteeism data. So it should be able to be disaggregated by high ability learner. And then from there, the interventions are more closely tied to academic than they are to a mental health or behavioral issue, because again, maybe they've developed some of that avoidance of school because they are bored out of their brains and they can't stand going to school, or maybe it could be we need a SEBL intervention about helping them make friends because they feel like they don't belong in school, or maybe they feel like their teacher doesn't get them. That's another really big one that we hear, is that like, my teacher doesn't get me. They tell me to stop asking questions. They feel like they don't belong in that classroom. And so a lot of times teasing that out is talking to the kid, talking to the parent. And if you have a big district, that can get really difficult. If you have, 40 high ability kids that are having this problem in your district, then that's really difficult to tease out. But at the school level, or at the kind of classroom individual level, that's where we really start to figure out where those issues are taking place. And then we can look at, as a whole, 30 of our 40 high ability kids said it was due to boredom or things like that. And so
Right.
I don't quite know if that answers your
Yeah.
question, but
That's super helpful. I thank you. And that's also assuming that we've got great processes in place to identify students how in the first place, which I think is hard for many of our districts. And that's a topic for another time, but thank you. This is fantastic. I'm loving every second of this. So thank you.
good. And I have a whole different PowerPoint about using different data metrics to identify high ability students, because if we have a bubble student test score wise, and we also see that their attendance is bad, or that they have a lot of office referrals, like, we're not putting those together and saying how, we're putting those together and saying like behavior issue. So that's a complete,
Right.
you're right, that's a whole
I'm
separate.
loving everything you're saying. I could talk to you for days. So thank you so much. This
Please
is great.
do. You have my email. Really quickly in the last few minutes. So we can also tier our supports for our high ability students based on their specific social, emotional, behavioral needs. Again, we tier supports, not students. We like to say HAL students, or special education students, or English language learner students. We do that a lot, but we tier the support. So the student who has a high ability also needs support making friends, things like that. We know that it's, all some few. We're familiar with the layered continuums of supports. And a lot of the core strategies that we're going to share are good for all students, but they also particularly target a skill that high ability students struggle with. So these are not necessarily unique to HAL. A couple of them are, but a lot of them are good for all students that just have that particular HAL flavor. And you have these slides, so you can look through all of these, but some of the really important ones are understanding high ability. There are book resources that are in here as well. Like, what does it mean to be high ability? What does it not mean? Trying to kind of get away from that. Always have to be high grades, perfect all the time. Identity formation. We have a lot of management strategies that, again, are good for all kids, but a lot of this growth mindset and praising the process our high ability kids struggle with, because they don't want to be wrong, so they struggle with risk taking, things like that. Relationships, we talked about placing them with their likability peers. So if they're high in math, it's not bad to send them to 4th grade for math if they're in 3rd grade, because then they can interact cognitively with peers who are closer to their level. And then if we get into the higher tiers, we want to make sure that we're providing appropriate academic interventions before we jump into higher behavioral interventions for these students. Look at their academic data. You can even ask them. A high ability student will tell you if their academic program is mismatched to them. And so we can't assume that they need a behavior support if we're not sure that their academic support matches. We also have a lot of tier 2 and tier 3 strategies. Sorry, time kind of got away from me. And some tips for teachers is always to support students, encourage their strengths, develop their talents, establish those connections, and always provide those effective programs based on where they're at in their development.
So the last few slides go through a variety of different resources. So if you see here, we've got some book recommendations, The Gift When Gifted Children, Jacob's Ladder, just some awesome resources with links right there. And then the National Association for Gifted Children, a lot of fabulous resources. I know there was some ideas maybe around parents in the comments. So that resource, that second resource of the parent tip sheet might be a great thing. Love the idea of potentially looking at continuing some more resources and programs around how students and parents and that. So we really appreciate Cheyenne being with us today. And then we have another slide, a couple different oh, whoops, we get a little excited sometimes, those videos. There's some different recordings and resources there. Again, the supporting emotional needs of the gifted children. And then, so lots of great resources. As always, we want to make sure that you're aware of our NeMTSS Summit, which is coming up September 26th and 27th. So soon, as September is next week, which I'm still trying to figure out where July went. So it's kind of crazy. But we are super excited to bring in some great speakers and have some information to share with everyone. So there's a link there to register if you have not. As always, here's the link for our Coffee Connects. This semester, we are highlighting and partnering with different departments at NDE, different areas of NeMTSS. So, and finding those connections to SEBL, just like today was high ability learners and the connections to SEBL. Here again is our full team. So we are excited to help support you across the state. Reach out to any of our SEBL specialists if you have any questions or concerns. And then our last final thing is we have a quick optimistic closer. I think it's in there, optimistic closure. So maybe just think to yourself as you jump off the Zoom and you're getting ready to start your day. So answer these questions. You know, what was one takeaway? What's one idea or you're excited to share with your colleagues? Or I saw in the chat, maybe a husband or maybe somebody else. Bud, what's an area of opportunity for you? How to build your house students in your building, or what's a question you need to have? And as Cheyenne said, her contact information is in the slideshow. Her email is there. She is more than welcome. She also just put it in the chat. She is more than welcome to connect with anybody in the state on how we can better serve our house students and support their needs as we are supporting the needs of all students in our districts. And really making sure that we have great supports for our students. So we thank you for your joining us this morning. We know we went a few minutes over, but we'll stay on for a few minutes if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, we will see you on September 18th.